today we are going to discuss tension. This is pretty contradictory. On a very happy day, we are going to talk about tension. But this is not the tension of our life, this is the tension in literature. Alan Tate, whose complete name is John Orley Allen Tate, and sometimes short questions can be asked. The full name of Allen Tate, John Orley Allen Tate. He was an American poet as well as a critic. And here, in this particular essay, that is Tension in Poetry, he is discussing about the textual characteristics of poetry. Tate belongs to the new critic school of critical scholars, and like other new critical critics, he is also trying to bring out the critical approach within the literary text by empowering the text. So he is telling that many poems that we ordinarily think of as good and some besides that we neglect have certain common features that will allow us to invent for their sharper apprehension the name of a single quality. I shall call that quality tension. So he is telling every good poetry is having a single quality or is having a consistent quality, that is tension. And he is elaborating the tension as the distinct quality as the ultimate effect of the whole. That whole is the result of a configuration of meaning which it is the duty of the critic to examine and evaluate. That means the tension is the ultimate wholeness of meaning in poetry. Or in his view, we can say that this singular quality enables the reader to concentrate and focus on the effect generated through its internal textual properties. That this tension is responsible for making the reader concentrate on the poetic effects generated by the intention of the poet or the internal textual properties. The textual property, that effect is realized by the reader through this tension. So tension is that quality. And then he is telling, if we examine the lyric, the more obscure it becomes, the more we trace the implications of the imagery, the denser the confusion. The imagery adds nothing to the general idea that it tries to sustain. It even deprives that idea of the dignity. So he is telling that sometimes we find in the poetry that the imagery that the poet is using, whether to give us a clarity or he is trying to bring a deeper confusion. Suppose the poet is telling that my love is like a red, red rose. So there is an imagery. But if the further imageries are added, my love is also like a yellow rose, like a peacock bird, like this, like that. Because in some poems you will find the poet is going on adding so many imageries. So if we consider the succession of the imageries, we may find that they are really confusing me, whether the love is this or the love is that. So he's telling that that is the tension in poetry. The poetry is having such type of tension where the imageries added by the poet in the poem brings confusion in place of clarity, and the communication becomes a fallacy. So he is telling poetry is the embodiment of the fallacy of communication. Poetry is not communicating. Why poetry is not communicating? Because poetry is not communicating in the ordinary sense, in the realistic sense. Poetry is communicating somewhere else. But poetry is not communicating like history, like a statement. So he is telling it is a fallacy of communication. But then he is telling, then how can we discuss this tension? What is this tension in poetry? The tension which creates the confusion, the tension which doesn't give us a clarity of meaning or suggestiveness. Then he is telling this tension, if we use the general term of a metaphor, because poetry uses metaphor. So what is the function of the metaphor? Already we have discussed about the two parts of metaphor. What are they? The tenor and the vehicle. But he is telling the metaphor has two purposes. The metaphor has two parts, tenor and vehicle, the original idea and the extension. But here he is telling metaphor is having two purposes. What are they? One is extension, another is intention. The poet is intending something and he is using the metaphor for that purpose. A rose is a metaphor because the poet is having some intention to convey. But at the same time, the poet is also using the metaphor to extend the idea, to elaborate the idea, much more than a very brief communication. The brief communication of the lover is extended by the use of metaphor. So he is telling that this tension is the result of these two dimensions of metaphor, that is extension and intention. In both there is tension. One is in, another is X. So he is telling the function of these two, extension and intention, somewhere in between extension and intention, there is the tension. And he is telling how this tension is working. He is telling tension is not to be confused with metaphor. Tension is not metaphor. A metaphor is one of many elements that informs the function of language in literature. But tension is something that embodies the overall making of meaning through a dynamic gelling of forces that emerge to make the eventual effect. So that is the difference between a metaphor and tension. Metaphor is one of the function of languages, or it is a part of the embellishment in the language. But tension is the process of meaning, the dynamic process of meaning, when the meaning is emerging within the poetry and ultimately creates some effect. So, extension and intention are indicators of that tension. Through them, we get the idea of tension in poetry. And he is telling that when we are trying to appreciate a poem, at every stage, we are taking a pause, trying to decipher the meaning, and trying to develop a coherence between one stage of meaning and the second stage of meaning, so that ultimately we can find a complete meaning, a whole meaning. If there is no consistency, there cannot be any proper meaning. So, tension is a dynamic process of relationship between extension and intention that creates the meaning in a continuous and coherent manner. Clear? And now he is giving some example that he is talking about Marvels, Andrew Marvels to his coy mistress. And he is telling, suppose there are two types of critics. One is the Platonic critic who approach this poetry from the Platonic concept of love. And to these poets, to these critics, the poem may be having the concept of a love poem, which is sometimes bringing immorality. It is immoral to the Platonic concept of love, because here we have the physical, sensual aspect of love. But if there is a Marxist critic, the Marxist critic may find a different meaning in the poem, that this poem is not about the love of the middle class or the aristocratic class, but this is the love poetry of the common man, for whom there is not much distinction between the sensual love and that Platonic love. They intermingle with each other. And he is telling that in this way, what we find, that the meaning of the poem may differ for different cultural or political or social ideas, and that is due to the tension between extension and intention. What is the intention of the poet and what is the intention of the reader? They may differ. And he is giving another example from Donne's poem. Our two souls, therefore, which are gone through, I must go, endure not yet a breach but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. And here he is telling what is the finite image of the gold. In extension, it logically contradicts the intensive meaning, because soul is immortal, gold is soul is immortal, expansive, limitless. Gold is an element which is having limitation. So here gold is contradicting the intensive meaning. But on the other hand, if we look, gold is also bringing the intention properly. If we look at the intention part of the poem, that the poet wanted to immortalize that love like gold, because gold is the element through which we want to immortalize, bring the highest form of our appreciation. So from that point of view, the meaning is there. So in this way, he is telling that there is a slight tension or contradiction between the extension and intention. Therefore, he is telling intention and extension are here one, and they enrich each other. But this poem, when we go through the poem, ultimately we get the meaning. And why the meaning is coming? Because we are accepting both the extension and intention, because they are mutual. He is telling, if we reject the gold, we reject the meaning. For the meaning is wholly absorbed into the image of the gold. Therefore, he is telling finally that the metaphysical poet as a rationalist begins at or near the extensive or denoting end of the line. The romantic symbolist poet, at the other hand, intensive end, and each by straining feet of the imagination tries to push his meaning as far as he can towards the opposite end. That means the metaphysical poet was a rational poet. So he begins from the extensive or extension purpose of denoting the meaning by the end of the line. But romantic or symbolist poet, they begin from intention, and from intention they are going towards the imagination. So each are approaching differently, and by their approach, what they are doing, they are trying to reach at the opposite end. That means metaphysical poets start from extension, they reach in the intention. What they intend, they get by the end of the poetry. And romantic and symbolist poets, they begin from intention and they reach in extension. So he is telling all the poetry in the world, they work between this extension and intention, but they are all marked by a common feature, that is tension. The tension or the dynamism of developing a meaning between extension and intention. So the achievement of such experience from an appreciation of different layers of poetry is tension.